If you're in a dictatorship, then the dictator and his cronies and the standing army or secret police force or whatever will have that power. If you're going to have popular sovereignty, then the people will have that power.
The YouTube film entitled Innocents Betrayed, produced by Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, documents the hopelessness of populations that have been disarmed or outgunned by their governments throughout history.
What happens when self-defense is against the law? What happens when the protectors become the predators? What happens when innocents are betrayed? Imagine that 2/3 of all Americans disappear.
The police are not meant to be able to outgun the citizens. We didn't even have police forces until New York in the 1840s, and then they were famous gangs that abused people. It's the citizens that are the real police, but now the servants are trying to become the masters, and that's basically what's been happening.
The Founding Fathers would have looked at our modern police forces as standing armies of crime. The police would not be allowed to outgun the common citizens because the common citizens are supposed to be functioning in the militia. The militia is supposed to check and balance against standing armies. The police are looked at as standing armies. Clearly the militia should have firearms at least as good as what the police have in case the police should go rogue.
Henry David Thoreau is one of the guys in history who he's still famous, even though he said some things that are still pretty darn radical, and he recognized that having respect for politician commands, which they call laws, isn't really worth anything. It doesn't do humanity any good. In fact, it does the opposite, because it will lead people to do things that otherwise they would recognize as evil, because, well, it's the law. We have to follow the law. Even if it doesn't match our own morals and our own virtues, we have to follow it because it's the law.
Thus, all general gun control legislation emanating from the federal government is subject to being disregarded and rendered ineffective by the states on the basis of the militia clauses in the Constitution alone, with no reference to the Second Amendment even necessary.
It's only the people who stand up against it who see the brute force inherent in all government. The people who went along with slavery when it was legal, they didn't get in trouble. The people who saw that as evil and say, we're not going to put up with that. I don't care if you call it law. We're not going to put up with that. They're the ones who saw the violence inherent in the system.
Foremost ignored words in the English language, a well-regulated militia. That's found at the beginning of the first half of the Second Amendment. Why is it everyone starts midway through the sentence?
The militia are so important, they rank amongst 7 and only 7 institutions the Constitution specifically names and treats as permanent. These institutions, in order of importance, are we the people, the militia, the states, the United States, the Congress, the President, the Supreme Court.
The militia are composed of the people themselves, and they exercise the ultimate power of government, the power of the sword. So it's putting the militia at the very highest level because the Constitution does not identify Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, or even the states as necessary to the security of a free state or necessary to the security of anything for that matter. Only the militia are identified as necessary.
The militia rank alongside we the people themselves, because the militia are the people. In fact, the people's very sovereignty depends on our control of the power of the sword through our militia. The astute citizen will note that neither the Army, Navy, nor any department can claim a constitutionally mandated existence, nor can they exist at all unless Congress specifically acts. The militia, on the other hand, exist whether Congress acts or not.
Who wants to be governed? Nobody. But we all want to be protected, don't they? And the purpose of the American Constitution, if you read it very carefully, and the Bill of Rights in particular, is not to govern people, but to protect.
The Constitution does not recognize a militia of the United States.
And it's because of this unconstitutional act that Congress passed, Title 10, the militia of the United States. There's no such thing as a militia. It's unconstitutional right on its face. They are state institutions there.
The President may only call forth a state militia for the three constitutional purposes, and the governor is under no obligation to accede to such a call if he feels the mission is unconstitutional. Militia deployment is yet another check and balance the founders built into our constitutional system to prevent the federal government from usurping power.
The whole idea of the militia was to protect the states against the federal government. It was to be one of the very serious, tangible checks and balances against a federal government that might conceivably grow beyond the limits of what are in primarily Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There are only about 18 things the federal government is supposed to do, and a lot of the rest of what we have going on in Washington simply is not constitutional.
Because the Constitution guarantees the permanent existence of the militia as integral elements of the balance of power, the President, the Congress, the Supreme Court, nor any state can disarm them. For disarmed militia are no militia at all. Thus, if Congress, influenced by some gun control lobby, neglects to provide appropriate arming of the militia, as stipulated in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, the states must arm their militia anyway and take legal action to thwart any unconstitutional legislation passed under the influence of the gun controllers.
It's pretty obvious, I think, by now that the so-called gun control lobby that seeks to disarm Americans really, if you look at who they are, almost all of them have some kind of a direct or indirect financial or political tie to the government itself. And since we know that governments, especially powerful, tyrannical governments, do not want citizens to be armed, and they're all for gun control, it's not difficult to understand why the people who are either in government or are dependent upon government or close to government in some way should be in the vanguard calling for gun control. They do not want people to be armed to resist a tyrannical government because they are part of that tyrannical government.
Thomas Jefferson said that the one thing that was essential to the maintenance of liberty was that people never lose what he called the spirit of resistance. Whenever we see any attempt to strip us of our fundamental freedoms, especially the freedom of the right to keep and bear arms, there can be no compromise. The line in the sand must be drawn on this issue, or the First Amendment and all the other amendments to our Constitution are really irrelevant.
The founders wrote the U.S. Constitution so we, the people, would always have our state militia to guarantee there will be no repeat of tyranny like that suffered under King George.